Hello friends, a very warm welcome to Ansarkari. I am Vikas Bhardwaj. You would have noticed that in our previous themes and lectures we have tried to create a kind of a synchronization, and this synchronization is actually helping you to create a kind of a theme. These themes are automatically related with your general studies and also with your optional questions. More importantly, understanding different developments in the world before India's independence helps you to have a balanced approach and personality. Most importantly, now the world order is also changing, not only with India becoming a 5 trillion economy, the target is there, but it is more about what the world will be shaped by in next 50 years. So the learnings from the past events are very important and applied questions are coming in the mains examination. And even certain themes can be covered in the prelims in terms of maps, which is really helpful for you. So after covering Nazism and fascism and also understanding how important it is to see that such kind of totalitarian autarky, the idea of self-sufficient nation without any kind of import but all exports, and more importantly the idea of dictatorial and one person rule who claim to have all a centralized power in its hands. This was not being happened only with Italy and Germany, but it was little beyond also. So let's see how Japan was there before the Second World War. Why did Japan become a military dictatorship and how it recovered, and how was Spain it was behaving in 1920s and 30s, and why there was outbreak of a civil war in Spain in 1936. Let's see. We have already discussed once. You can recall and you can see your notes in your iPad, and I have discussed in our personal WhatsApp and other interactions also that it is very important to see to have a sequence of industrialization. So you can recall those points where we have discussed that how Japan became an industrialized nation, and it is also on the verge of becoming a great power when it is beating Russia by 1905. So let's try to see it a little bit again, because by 1918 Japan was in a very strong position in the Far East. We can recall that Japan's contact with the Western world goes back to 1853 when American Commodore Matthew Perry he sailed into Yokohama harbor with 4 battleships and demanded that Japan should open trade with USA. Don't you think something of same sort is happening in today's time also? But in other ways. Over the next 5 years, Japan had to sign trade treaties with several Western countries, and it was clear that Western powers had imperialistic designs on Japan. That means they want to control it, they want to subdue it, they want to get drain of wealth from there, they want to subdue their culture, subdue their political structures, subdue their economies, subdue their way of life, like the way it happened with India. And these treaties were signed between the Western powers and Japan and regarded by the Japanese as a great national humiliation. The pride, the anger, the emotion, the love for motherland, the love for our ancestors, the love for the culture, it is overpowering. It is too much to bear, and that is why human beings also want to be free all the times. So by 1868, a restoration of Meiji Emperor, Japanese embarked on a policy of building railways, improving road system, starting modern industries, cotton and silk manufacture, introducing more democratic parliamentary system model on Germany's constitution. So Japan became a unified centralized empire, one can say rekindling of its nationalistic fervor. The government decided that the best way to prevent the Western powers from treating Japan in the same way as China was to occupy neighboring territories. That is why first Korea and then Manchuria were colonized, and because of that, certain wars were also fought. First with China 1894-95, and then with Russia in 1905. Japan being victorious in the both, and the Russian was an example for the first time that the Asian country had defeated at one of the European great powers. So Japan became a dominant power in the Far East. A military alliance already being signed with Britain in 1902 and the First World War started in 1914. We have already discussed Japan entered the war on the side of Britain and their main contributions was to seize German colonies, bases in China and so forth. Japan was represented at the Versailles Peace Conference and became a member of the League of Nations and was officially recognized as one of the big five world powers. Not in the present times. It is not one of the big five powers, especially after the Second World War when it was greatly subdued and greatly controlled, or you can say greatly remodeled by the US. Japan had a very powerful navy, well-trained and well-equipped army, and a great deal of influence in China. So you can understand that why Japan and China still they speak about the horrors and also the great wounds of the past. But the question arises, why did Japan become a military dictatorship? Because 1920s number of problems started and democratically elected governments were not capable of solving it. There were influential elite groups who were opposing democracy because democracy was still a new concept in Japan. Emperor gave way to the growing demands for national assembly in the belief that it was constitution and the representative government which had made the USA and countries like of the Western Europe so successful. That is why Diet, that means the lower house, elected lower house of the parliament, also came into being. The first elections were held and the Diet met in 1890. But the system was far from democratic and the emperor retained enormous powers. Emperor was seen as next to God. He cannot be let down under any circumstances because he could dissolve Diet whenever he felt like it. He could decisions of war and peace. He was commander in chief of the armed forces. He was regarded as sacred and inviolable, as I just said. But the Diet had one great advantage. It could initiate new laws, cabinet could also be formed, and that's how it was not susceptible to their will as they had expected. The first elite groups in society were content to give the government free rein. At least government can do whatever it thinks for. It can do certain experiments for the betterment of society. But after the First World War, there were critical situations arise. That is how elite groups they seized every opportunity to discredit the government. For example, they criticized the Baron Shidahira Kijuru, the foreign minister in the interwar time period, for his conciliatory approach to China because he thought it was the best way to strengthen Japanese economic hold over the country. And the army was more than itching, like the today's time the great powers do, to interfere in China, which was torn by civil war. That is why Shidahira's policy was seen to be very soft, ineffective, and they were actually the powers were actually strong enough to bring the government down in 1927 and reverse this policy. Many politicians were corrupt. They regularly accepted bribes from big business. Sometimes fighting broke out in lower house also as charges and counter charges of corruptions were there. System no longer inspired respect and prestige of the parliament too suffered irreparably. That is why the trade boom, because in 1929, you can say around that time period, economic problems were added to the political ones and the situation became serious. And only until the middle of 1921, when the Europe began to revive and recover lost markets in Japan, unemployment, industrial unrest, and at the same time falling prices of the farmers, it was causing a great hazard to the nation. So the situation was such: the farmers and industrial workers, when they were trying to unite themselves into a political party, they will be ruthlessly suppressed by the police. So the workers as well as army and the right wing or the right leaning people or the ideology they became hostile to the parliament, which are actually calling itself democratic but allowed the left to be suppressed, accepted bribes from big businesses at the same time. So you can say that different ideologies are ruling the nations, or you can say the diet, and actually many sections of society are not happy. And the world economic crisis, as I just said, by the 1920s or 1929, by 1929, there will be impact on the export of raw silk, which went mostly to the USA. And the period after Wall Street crash was no time for luxuries, and the American drastically reduced their imports of raw silk, so that by 1932 the price had fallen to less than one fifth of the 1923 figure. Even in today's time, we know that if you see, for example, if a trade pact had been there between the US and Japan, and the Japan is ready to open its politically sensitive rice market, but on the other hand, Japan is very keen to export the automobile and also its components to the US at 10% because it knows very well that it will be able to recover, and it is the automobile sector which is the key, more than say 10% to the GDP of Japan. Similarly, the situation in Manchuria was also one of the reasons, apart from these economic, political, and social reasons, that Manchuria being a large province of China with a population of 30 million, in which Japan had valuable investments and trade, Chinese were trying to squeeze out Japanese trade and business, which would have been a severe blow to Japanese economy, already hard, really, I should say, already very badly hit by depression. To preserve their economic advantage, the Japanese army units invaded and occupied Manchuria in September 1931. And on the top of it, it is happening without permission from the government. So for next 13 years, army more or less is running that country or this part of the country, introducing similar methods to be adopted in Italy and Germany. So, ruthless suppression of communists, assassination of opponents, tight control of education, build-up of armaments, and an aggressive foreign policy which aimed to capture territory in Asia to serve as market for Japanese exports. This will be the theme. This led to an attack on China in 1937, participation in the Second World War in the Pacific, and for the next 13 years, army more or less reigned the country, introducing, as I just said, similar methods to like that of Germany and Italy. So, the question arises that all this, what was happening, this was actually leading to the suppression of democracy and democratic power under all circumstances. So you see how North Pacific Island, I should say, not North Pacific Ocean, I should say, and how Japan is actually trying to create a great place for itself. When the Second World War began, it seems that the emperor genuinely wanted to stay out of it. He hesitated over whether to sign or not to sign an alliance with Nazi Germany. After the early success of Germany Bridge Creek, he agreed to the alliance and eventually attacked on Pearl Harbor, the photograph was just showing, thereby giving military the chance to achieve their ambition to continue with the conquest of China and Southeast Asia. The war began successfully for Japanese. By 1942 May, they had captured Hong Kong, Malaya, Singapore and Burma, all belonging to Britain. The Dutch East Indies, the Philippines and the two American possessions, Guam and Wake Island, also were captured by the Japanese. No way to stop them. However, it became clear that the attack on Pearl Harbor was not quite a success. It had seemed. It did not destroy the American aircraft carriers which were out at sea, and it was the aircraft carriers that proved to be the vital element in Japanese defeat. Americans using planes from the three aircraft carriers inflicted severe defeat on the Japanese at Midway Island. You should remember these key places, and you will understand that actually it is the key development in these time period which were the result of Japanese defeat, which resulted into Japanese defeat, that I should say. So this proved to be a crucial turning point in the war, with Japanese suffering a series of reverses over the next 3 years. It was a long and bitter struggle, that we agree, which ended in August 1945 with the Japanese surrender after Americans had dropped two atomic bombs, one on Hiroshima, other on Nagasaki, and Japan's ambition of a great empire were dashed, and the country's economy was largely in ruins, which went on to rise again because of its own willpower. So you can see the United States going to expand its, I should say, influence, and expand its possessions: Alaska, Puerto Rico, Guam, Midway Atolls, Palmyra Atoll, Wake Islands, American Samoa, and Guantanamo Bay. So you can also understand that United States was becoming slowly but surely very powerful in the interwar years, and especially after the Second World War. And United States, and in fact you can think about this is how United States is, and then at the same time this is the Midway Island. Hawaiian Island is over here, Alaska is also over here, American Samoa is also over here. So America went on to purchase, America went on to occupy, or unilateral decision was taken up because other powers were not so powerful so that they could talk about it. Philippine Islands 1898, and Guam is also over here, and this is Japan and Korea. Boxer uprising in China in 1900. But at the end of the Second World War, Japanese were defeated, their economy were in ruins, and large proportion of their factories and quarter of their houses were destroyed by the bombing. Until 1952, the country was occupied by Allied troops. Please remember, from 1945 to 1952, mostly American under the command of General MacArthur. First 3 years, Americans aimed to make sure Japanese could never again start a war. They were forbidden to have armed forces and were given democratic constitution under which the ministers had to be members of DITE. Nationalist organizations were disbanded and the armament industry was dismantled. People who had played leading roles in the war were removed and an international tribunal was set up to deal with the accused of war crimes. And the war-time Prime Minister Tojo and 6 others were executed. 16 men were given life sentences. But the question arises, how was Japan's rapid recovery possible even after such circumstances? American help was vital in the early years of Japanese recovery. The USA decided that an economically healthy Japan would be a strong bulwark against the spread of communism in Southeast Asia. It was important to move Japan away from the semi-feudal and hierarchical system, which was restrictive in progress and also restrictive in the future growth. A land reform plan was introduced which took much of the land away from the landlords and sold it to tenants at reasonable rates, creating a new class of owner farmers. American helped in other ways also. Japanese goods were allowed into American market on favorable terms and the USA supplied aid and the new equipment. Now think about what today USA is trying to do and think about what USA has done 75 years ago. The Korean War 1950 to 53 gave an important boost to Japanese recovery. Japan was ideally placed to act as a base for the United Nations forces involved in Korea. India also supported, not in the war but to mediated in the war efforts so that war can be stopped between in the Korean Peninsula. Japanese manufacturers were used to provide a wide range of material and supplies. The close relationship with USA meant Japan's security was well taken care of. This meant Japan was able to invest in industry all the cash that would otherwise have been put on armaments. That is how Japan became a great power. Much of the Japanese industry had been destroyed during the war. This enabled the new factories and plants to start afresh with all the latest technology. Government decided to concentrate on high technology goods by 1959, both for the home market and for exports. The demand for export market led to construction of larger and faster transport ships. So now you can think of that how India, when it is fighting with twin enemies on the eastern front and on the western front in terms of China and Pakistan, how India is doing great and amazing in spite of these two powers always trying to stop and always trying to create obstacles and hurdles through terrorism and other kind of nefarious activities. By 1972, Japan had overtaken West Germany to become world's third largest economy, specialization in shipbuilding, radio, television, hi-fi equipment, cameras, steel, motorcycles, motor cars and textiles. Think of what not India had imported from Japan, and today also India's bullet train is being supported and also run by Japan. So recovery was helped by a series of stable governments. They were afraid that their land would be nationalized if the socialists came to power. The LDP was constantly in the government from 1952 until 1993. The main opposition was provided by the Japan Socialist Party, which changed its name to Social Democratic Party of Japan in 1991, and it drew the most support from the workers, trade unions, and the large slice of city population. So the Japan recovery was not without problems. There was a good deal of anti-American feeling in some quarters always in Japan. Many Japanese felt inhibited by their close ties to Japan. They felt Americans exaggerated the threat from communist China. They wanted good relations with China and USSR, but it was difficult with Japan so firmly in the American camp. That is why the renewal of defense treaty with the US in 1960 caused strikes and demonstrations, and this treaty is still going on. There was a resentment among the older generation, the way in which the Japanese youth culture was taking on all things American, which was seen as a sign of moral decay, and that's what I've personally seen also when I visited Japan. In Japan, it was very difficult for me to get anything cultural, anything to do with the handicrafts or even folk culture which is not made in USA. Another problem was the working class unrest along long working hours and overcrowded living conditions. So Japanese high growth rate came to end by early 1970s. Japanese prosperity aroused some hostility abroad. There were constant protests from USA, Canada and Western Europe. The Japanese were flooding foreign markets with their exports while refusing to buy comparable amounts of import from their customers. So do you think this also sounds like what China is doing today? Japanese militarism, when we see in terms of question, the rise of militarism in Japan between the two world wars, how it affected the peace of the world, trace of growth of militarism in Japan in the interwar years, and what international reaction did it provoke? Japanese policy in relation to Manchuria. This is also you have to see Japanese policy in relation to Manchuria reacted back upon Japan, affected her both economically and politically. It has been asked in 1982. So, how the presence of weak and helpless China next door brought about rise of militarism and collapse of democracy in China. This question had also been asked. Now let's see what happened in Spain in 1920s and 30s, because the constitutional monarchy under Alfonso XIII, king since 1885, was never very efficient and reached rock bottom by 1921, when Spanish armies sent to put down a revolt led by Abdel Karim in Spanish Morocco was massacred by Moors. In 1923, General Primo de Rivera seized power in a bloodless coup with Alfonso's approval, that is the ruler, and the rule for next 7 years. The king called him my Mussolini. But though Primo was a military dictator, he was not a fascist. He was responsible for a number of public works, railways, irrigation, roads, industrial production, developed at 3 times before 1923, and the most impressive of all, he succeeded in ending war in Morocco in 1925. When the world economic crisis, as we have seen already, reached Spain in 1930, employment rose, and the Primo and his advisors, they bungled the finances, and it led to depreciation of the currency. Army withdrew support, Primo resigned, and by April 1931, municipal elections were held in which the Republicans won all the control of the large cities. A huge crowd gathered on the streets of Madrid, and the King Alfonso had to abdicate in order to avoid bloodshed. That is how Republic was proclaimed in Spain. The monarchy had been overthrown without bloodshed, and unfortunately, the slaughter had merely been postponed until 1936, because that is what you have to see what happened, because it was a kind of a chingari, as we have seen in the case of Balkans also. So, everywhere in the world, the things have happened by the people when their passions, when their courage, when their, you know, uh, common sense and well-being at the center. Otherwise, war had never been helpful. This is very important for the PT Rif War 1921 to 26, Morocco's Berber uprising. You can always remember this. So why did the civil war break out in Spain in 1936, when we have discussed that things were so easily and so good going on? Catalonia, very important in the for the prelims. Catalonia and Basque provinces, they wanted independence even today also. Roman Catholic Church was hostile to the Republic, which in turn disliked the Church. They both were antagonistic to each other, and they were looking forward how to increase their own power. Army had too much influence in politics, and it may go for another coup. That is what it was believed. There were additional problems caused by depression. Agriculture prices were falling, olive and wine exports were declining, land went out of cultivation, peasant unemployment was there. In industry, iron production fell by third and steel production by almost half. It was time of falling wages, unemployment, and declining standards of living, unless it could make some headway with this final problem. The Republic was likely to lose support of the workers, and that is what was going to happen. Right wing opposition, that means the left solution to these problems were not acceptable to the right, which became increasingly alarmed at the prospect of social revolution, everything going to the government and no private property, no private goal. The dominant group in the courties, that is parliament, the socialist and middle class radicals, began energetically. Catalonia was allowed some kind of self-government. An attack was made on the church and the state. The church and state were separated. Priests would no longer be paid by government. Jesuits were expelled, and the other orders were also dissolved, and the religious education in the school stopped. A large number of army officers were compulsorily retired. A start was made on nationalization of large states. Attempt was made to raise the wages of industrial workers. So that is how Spain, if you can see, was going to have a different kind of atmosphere. But the left-wing opposition, which was also believing that it has the right to move further, because it was weakened, the republic was weakened further. On one side, you have left opposition, because the two powerful left wings, the anarchists and the syndicate groups, a group of powerful trade unions, who favored a general strike and overthrow of the capital system, they were also not ready to compromise on their ideas. And the actions of the new right-wing government, they were designed to reverse the progressive elements of Azana's policies, and understandably, it was actually not appreciated by the left. Therefore, most of the land reforms were cancelled by the right wing, interfered with the working of the new Catalonian government, refused to allow Basque self-government. This was a serious error, since Basque had supported the right in the elections, but now they had switched to the left because they wanted their own sovereignty, their own freedom. That is why you can say that all these developments were leading to chaos, and that is why there will be an uprising, civil uprising in Spain in 1926, and there will be, a lot of changes taking place at the grassroots level. There will be helping nationalists, that is German plus Portuguese, and there will be helping Republicans. Russian troops will also be there. International Brigade is also there, and you can think about Spanish Morocco over here, and this is going till 1939. The Spanish Civil War is very, very important development, and it is going to pave the way, like the way we have discussed, how uh, there is going to be influence in the whole Europe, and how Italy and Germany, they will be one of the leading powers for the Second World War. So thank you very much for understanding and making notes and giving your precious time for your success, because without understanding what Japan was doing in the interwar time period and why it became a great power, or without understanding what happened in Spain and why this civil war is so crucial to understand rest of the events, we cannot appreciate creatively and constructively what the Second World War and what other kind of events are going to do to the rest of the world. Thank you very much for being with Ansarkari. Make your own notes. Make sure to have answering all these questions, and also make sure that you are doing them quickly, consistently, and smartly. Thank you very much.